Hello, my name's Charles Duval, and I'm a retired Episcopal bishop living here at Still Hopes with my wife Nancy. In my retirement, as I was active, I delight to tell Bible stories, and I'd like to share one with you today. This is going to be a story about Moses, and the only way you can tell the story about Moses is to do one little historical footnote first. Back 200 or 300 years before Moses, there was a wonderful man by the name of Joseph who ended up in Egypt, having been sold into slavery by his brothers. But in his mercy and generosity, he allowed them to come to Egypt, and they fed them and took care of them, and everybody was happy. And when the famine was over, Moses' family, no, that was Joseph's family. Joseph's family stayed there in Egypt. They prospered, they had children. Of course, the Egyptians were prospering and having children too. But the Hebrew children seemed to come along more regularly than the Egyptian children did. And so finally, several hundred years later, the Pharaoh said, everywhere I look, there are these Hebrew children. We've got to do something about them. Pretty soon there'll be more of them than there are of us. This is another one of those Bible stories that has a them and us in it. Well, the Egyptians thought if they, the Hebrew, got to be too prosperous, too numerous, they could overthrow the Egyptians and take over their land. So the Pharaoh started some programs that would calm them down a little bit. First, he gave them some terrible work orders, hard work orders, hard to do. They were making bricks out of clay and straw. And when that didn't seem to work or calm them down much, he finally said, all right, from now on, every male Hebrew child who is born is to be drowned right away. Now, girls we can put up with because they can wash clothes and dishes and scrub the floor and that sort of thing. But boys, they're dangerous. So the word went out. Unfortunately, the word went out at a time when one of the Hebrew slave families was expecting a baby. They already had a daughter and a son, but a third child was on the way. And that mother said to herself, I'm not going to let them drown my son if it's a son. So she kept very quiet about the fact that she was about ready to have her baby. And she did not call in the midwives that Pharaoh had instructed to kill the male children. She hid the baby when it came. And she tried to keep quiet about having a baby in the household. But as most of you know, if you have a baby in the household, it's pretty apparent. They soon start crawling around. They make noises. They're up at night. There's all kinds of ways. But this was not a good thing. And so the mother decided, I think I'm going to have to do something to get this child in an Egyptian household. He's a perfectly fine child. Nothing wrong with him except that he's Hebrew rather than Egyptian. So she fed him one day, put him down for his nap. She had made a basket kind of a thing that was big enough for him to lie in, an ark. And she put him in that ark, and she took the ark down by the Nile River, and she put it in the reeds growing in the edge of the river, so that the current wouldn't wash him away, but some people might see him there who were Egyptian. In fact, she was so smart that she picked the very spot where the upper class Egyptians came to bathe and to wash in the river. And then she told her daughter, Miriam, she said, Miriam, I want you to sit up here on the bank, and I want you to watch and see who finds the baby and report to me. So Miriam was sitting up there, and lo and behold, the daughter of the Pharaoh came with her court of women that look after her to bathe in the river. And she saw the basket, the ark, over in the reeds. She says, I wonder what's in that basket. They went over there, and when she took the lid off, there was Moses. He was just waking up just a little bit and blowing bubbles and just as cute as he could be. And when the princess saw that little baby, she says, oh, I'd love to take that baby home with me. And they said, well, I don't know if you could do that. At that point, Miriam appeared. She said, oh, princess, that's our cute baby you're looking at there. I bet you could have a wonderful time playing dolls with that baby. And the princess said, well, yes, I do, but I've got a heavy social schedule. I don't know how I could take care of this baby. And Miriam said, well, I know a lady who said that she would be glad to be the nursemaid for this baby if somebody found him. And so she went and she got the mother. She said, Mother, the princess from the palace has found the baby, and I have volunteered you to be a nursemaid for the baby if you want to have the job. Well, the mother said, of course I want to have the job. And so she went up to the palace with Miriam's guidance and said, I'm here to take care of the baby that you found today. And the princess was delighted. And so the mother started taking care of her baby in the Pharaoh's palace. Well, now, what did the princess say to her father, the Pharaoh, when she came home with a baby? She did what every good girl does. She thought of a good story to cover this business. She says, Daddy, I was down by the river and I found this child floating in a little ark right there in the reeds by the river. And he says, is that true? She said, it is true. It really is. I tell you what I'm going to call him. I'm going to call him Moses, because that's an Egyptian word that means I found you by the river. Or at least that's what she told her daddy that she meant by Moses. So this little Habiru child got an Egyptian name, Moses, and he grew up in the palace of the Pharaoh. And for the first several years, his mother was his nursemaid and made him aware that he not only was blessed to be in the palace, but he also had some kin who weren't very blessed. They were those slaves out there working. But soon he got so big that they said, you don't need a nursemaid anymore. So they sent his mother home. Well, there were a lot of advantages to being in the Pharaoh's palace. You had nice food, you had nice clothes, you had a wonderful gym where you could work out, with the various things. And over the years, Moses developed these shoulders out to heel. I tell you, it was impressive. And he also developed a pretty good arrogant attitude about being the Pharaoh's daughter's adopted son. And so he would kind of throw his weight around a little bit every now and then. For instance, one day he went down by the river and he saw this work crew. And this Egyptian overseer was supervising this work crew, and he was really giving them a hard time. And so Moses went over and said, hey, fella, says, let me give you a piece of advice. Says, they'll work a whole lot better for you if you're not so mean to them. And the Egyptian overseer says, who are you to tell me what to do and how to run my slave detail? And Moses grew up and he says, I am the son of the adopted son of the Pharaoh's daughter, and that's who I am. And at that point, his anger got away from him, and he grabbed that overseer with two hands like that, and he started shaking him. He was standing right by a wall, and the man's head hit the wall in such a way that it killed him. And Moses realized, oh my word, I have killed this man. So he told the slaves, go home, don't tell anybody what's happened. And then he took the body over into the wooded area there and hid him under some underbrush and went home, worried to death. And so that night on the news, there was no mention of anybody being killed on the street. And the next day in the paper, no news again. And Moses thought, well, I believe I'm going to get away with this. And nobody seems to have talked. But the next afternoon when he went out for one of these walks that he liked to do, he saw some Israelis, some Habiru, arguing with one another. And he said, look, fellas, y'all have a hard enough time without arguing with one another. You need to get this thing straight. And they looked him in the eye and they said, if we don't get it straight, you go kill us like you killed that Egyptian. And he realized the word was out. And if it was out among the slaves, it would be soon out among the Egyptians. And so he beat it home, went up to his room and got his backpack. And he filled it with some clean underwear, some socks, and then he went down by the palace kitchen and he got some biscuits and some water, filled his canteen, and he headed out, trying to get away from Egypt. Well, if you've ever looked at an Egyptian map, the country's kind of long like this, and somewhat narrow. And right down the middle of the country, you'll notice in the map, there's a green line. That's the Nile River. And some of the territory on either side of the Nile is green too, because that's where, being watered by the Nile, there's agriculture and things that are able to grow. But on either side of that green area, there's brown. That's desert. Well, Moses had studied some of this in the school, and he knew something about the geology, and he decided, well, I can either go east and get finally out into the brown area, or I can go west and get finally out into the brown area. I think I'll just go east. So he's headed out. Well, pretty soon he realized that the little bit of biscuits and water that he had would go give out. He needed to be traveling with somebody that had some food and water. He'd gotten beyond the agricultural part of Egypt, and he was looking around and he saw this caravan of camels. And he thought, I don't know where they're going, but I bet you the people who are running that caravan, they've got some water and something to eat. So I'm going to follow them. Well, he couldn't get too close to them, but he did catch up a little bit with them and followed them across the desert. And they came to an oasis, which they knew about. Moses didn't. And when the camels had gotten something to drink and everybody settled down, Moses came creeping into the oasis and he said, this water smells so good. And he just sort of fell down into the water and drank water and drank water and threw water over his head. Eventually the caravan left. But Moses, seeing all the palm trees around the oasis, he said, I believe I'll just stay here in the shade of the palm trees, and I got nowhere to go. See what happens. Well, what happened was that in the late afternoon, a herd of sheep came to the oasis to water. And he noticed that the shepherds who were taking care of those sheep were female. He was old enough by now to have noticed that kind of thing. And so he kind of brushed his hair back off of his face and straightened himself out a little bit. The girls watered, and he watched. And about that time, another herd of sheep came up. And they were run by some roughneck boys. And those boys said to the girls, says, hey, you girls, didn't we tell y'all to always wait for our sheep to water first before you let your sheep water? Y'all get these sheep out of here. Come on. And Moses stood up and he says, hey, fellas, I hate to tell you, but they got him first. First come, first served. And so y'all just gonna have to wait. And they said, says who? And by this time, Moses is standing up full tall, shoulders out to here. And he says in this gravelly voice, says me. And the boy says, well, maybe it'd be all right one time for them to water first. So the girls went ahead and watered first and took the sheep home. The boys ordered. When they got home, the girls said to their father, whose name was Jethro, said to Jethro, "Father, we're home early because there was this nice Egyptian fella, or at least he looked Egyptian, who was at the oasis, and he made those boys wait for us to order." And Jethro said, "Well, did you thank him?" And they said, "Well, of course we did." "Well, has he got anything to eat? Why didn't you bring him home? I could thank him myself." And they said, "Well, we didn't know we could do that." He said, "Well, you can." So one of them went back to the oasis, found Moses still there. He was enjoying that water and that cool shade. And she said, "Sir, our father said he'd like to thank you for taking care of us this afternoon. And would you come home for supper?" And he says, "Oh, I'd love to." So she took him home to supper and introduced him to their father-in-law, Jethro. And Jethro said, we're getting a nice meal together. I thought maybe you might enjoy some. He said, "Oh, I would." They were having fried chicken and collards and field peas and biscuits on the side. And he said, "This is a feast." Well, they were sitting there talking and eating, and Jethro said to Moses, "Son, what's your name?" He says, "My name's Moses." He says, "Where are you from?" "I'm from Egypt." "Well, I kind of guessed that since Moses is an Egyptian name. What you doing out here in the desert?" And Moses said, "Well, I'm a young fella. I'm just kind of going around trying to find my way and find out what life is like." And Jethro says, "Well, does that mean you don't have a job?" He says, "Yes, sir, I don't have a job." And he says, "Well, I got these girls who take care of the sheep, but they're always getting bullied by those boys. If you were in charge of the sheep, that wouldn't happen anymore. Would you work with me and take care of my sheep, my daughters? And tell you what, each year I'll help you build up your own flock." And so Moses said, "Well, that sounds good to me." And so Moses went to work for Jethro, and then he married one of Jethro's daughters, and they had a baby. And things were really looking good for Moses. He had a nice home tent, but it was a nice one because he was the son-in-law of the man who owned all the sheep. Well, one day he took some of the sheep out. One of the things about working with Jethro was that you found out where there was a little bit of water and where there was some grass over here if the rain had come recently. And you learned how to live in that kind of hard environment. But he now knew that if you went over this way at a certain time of the week and the year, you could find some water and some grass. So he took these sheep over there, and they were grazing. Moses was just kind of looking around. And this voice says, "Moses?" That puzzled Moses. He'd been with sheep long enough to know they did not talk. Not a one of them could say his name. Well, he looked around some more, and the voice says, "Moses, take off your sandals. You're on holy ground." And so Moses took off his sandals, and while he was sitting down like that, he looked over and there was this bush. And the bush seemed to be on fire, but it wasn't being consumed. And Moses said to the voice, "Who is that talking to me?" And the voice says, "It's God." He said, "God? What God?" See, the Egyptians had some God, and Habiru had some God, and the Midianites had some gods. And so he didn't know who this was. He says, "I'm the God of your fathers, of Jacob and Isaac and Joseph." Well, that got his attention. And he says, "Why do you want to talk to me?" He says, "Well, I've heard the cries of my children in Egypt. Those people you left behind, you remember, when you fled from Egypt? And I want to get them free. And I want you to go and do it for me." And Moses is down, wait a minute. I'm a fugitive of Egypt. I killed a man who worked for the Pharaoh, and I ran away. And the voice said, I'll take care of that. Well, now, how do I know you can do that? He says, well, I'm God. And I want you to tell your brethren in Egypt that the God of their fathers has sent you to get them free. And Moses says, well, what name will I use when I say God? And he said, Yahweh. And Moses thought about that a minute. Yahweh, I am what I am. I am what is. There's lots of ways you can translate it. But the main way is, I am. The God who is has spoken, and I want my children to come free. Well, Moses still wasn't convinced. And he says, they won't believe me, and neither will Pharaoh. And the voice said, see that staff you've got in your hand that you herd the sheep with? He says, throw that staff down on the ground. He threw it down on the ground, and it wiggled and turned into a snake. And Moses was a little taken aback at that. And he says, what am I to do now? He says, pick it up. Well, he leaned down very gingerly and picked it up, and it turned back into his staff. He says, when you meet Pharaoh, you tell him that God gave you the power to do that, and that's a proof that you are here working for God. So Moses said, okay, if you really want me to, I guess I'll go. So that night, when he went home, he told his wife, he says, I've got a business trip to Europe. Not to Europe. He's just going as far as Egypt. Both of them start with an E. But anyway, he says, I've got a business trip to Egypt, and I'm going to have to be away for a while, but I'll come back and get you. And that, friends and neighbors, is the first part of the preparation of Moses to lead the children of Israel out of slavery in Egypt and into the promised land. And if you're good, and if my legs hold up, I'll come back and tell you the second part sometime.